One quick question is, what do activists do when, like myself, I'm constantly followed around by individuals who seem to be very, very intelligent and really debating, or at least trying to debate with me and others, that chemtrails, A, do not exist, that chemtrails aren't even a word, that persistent contrails have been around for 100 years, that lingering contrails or persistent trails have been around forever, that we just never really notice them, and it's just more activity in the sky with commercial jets, etc. How would you answer that question if you were speaking to somebody like that?
Well, I know that during World War II, for example, that the B-17, for example, the Super Fortress, was a 4-engine propeller-driven aircraft with turbo-supercharged engines. They also had water alcohol injection, which does a couple of things to the combustion process. It helps to stretch out the expenditure of fuel, stretches the range of the aircraft, helps keep the engine cool, keeps some of the components in the engine clean. So when you have some kind of an injection process like that occurring, you will get condensation trails that do persist longer than normal. But this was something that was a wartime application. It was not something that was generally used throughout aviation. And so as a consequence, people saying that these kinds of condensation trails have been around forever is simply not true. I can understand that there are a lot of people who have an emotional stake in this, because they would never want to believe that the United States government would be using any kind of materials that might turn out to be harmful to people in this country. Things that we all breathe. I mean, one of the ingredients, several of the ingredients that we know are in these chemtrails are strontium and barium, and if you look up or do the same kind of search mechanism on those other materials, you'll find that if you breathe a fine powder of those kinds of materials enough, it can lead to pulmonary fibrosis, which is like scar tissue inside your lungs. So, obviously there are some documented hazards that will be encountered as a consequence of these materials being put into the air. And my rule of thumb when I see this stuff being used and wonder whether or not there's any kind of fallout from the material is here in Northern California, there's very little air pollution at all. It's completely the opposite of what you see in Southern California with all the smog in the Los Angeles basin. But up here, when these planes begin flying, usually first thing in the morning, we'll start with a deep blue sky, and as these aircraft begin crossing the sky back and forth, the trails begin to spread out, and it kind of creates a continuous white haze from horizon to horizon. But as the day wears on, you can begin to see this white haze begin to settle out as though it's actually heavier than the air at the altitude at which it was dispensed. And you look into the distance over towards, I'm in Redding, which is about 2 hours north of Sacramento, but you look to the east where there's Mount Lassen. There's a beautiful dormant volcano covered with a snow-capped kind of a glacier. It starts to haze out, not with the brownish discoloration that you find in smog, but with a pure white haze. It's as though a giant fog bank has been dropped down into the environment. Well, we've done a lot of sample testing up here in Northern California. There's a fellow that I know, Francis Mangles, who's a biologist who's been taking samples of the soil, from the trees, and from the water and the snow and everything, and we're finding that there's something like 6,000 times more aluminum oxide in the environment now than there was just 10 years ago, and higher levels of strontium and barium. And this is, sort of a verification that these components are being dispensed somehow into the environment, and it seems most obvious that they're coming from the planes. But beyond that, I mean, if you if you set aside the idea of, some malicious intent in the use of these materials to somehow affect or change the weather, modify the weather, geoengineering, what have you, there's at least a couple of other uses for the same kind of material, one of which, of course, is introducing aluminum oxide nanoparticles into the fuel stream of a jet engine. Adds a tremendous amount of oxygen to the combustion process, thereby making it more efficient and also extending the range of aircraft dramatically. And in some tests, they've added as much as 40% by weight to the jet fuel itself of aluminum oxide nanoparticles as small as 40 nanometers across, which is really too small to cause any kind of abrasion effects on the turbine blades. But because of the extremely fine particulation of the aluminum oxide particles, the reaction spreads through the material much faster. It has a way of helping the heat of the combustion process to propagate through the material and through the fuel at a much higher rate, which means you get a much faster and more complete combustion occurring. And, of course, this is also the same reason that these things are used in incendiary devices, pyrotechnics, and superthermate or thermite explosives. In fact, if you go up on Google and do a search of superthermite on Wikipedia, you'll see all the different variations of aluminum oxide and other materials that they add into these kinds of explosives to produce thermate. And when these explosions occur, the oxygen, the amount of oxygen that aluminum oxide introduces into the reaction is kind of a continuing reaction. It will continue for a long period of time, and you find that these kinds of explosives are most particularly useful for building demolition. In the controlled demolition of buildings, they put this kind of explosive material around the steel girders, and when the reaction goes off, it can go to temperatures somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 degrees in a fraction of a second, which cuts through these steel girders like a hot knife through butter. And, of course,
that's interesting, Mark. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's interesting because weren't the studies of 9/11 proving that they found thermite?
Yeah, Joseph, I think it was Stephen Jones of BYU University up in Provo, Utah, found all of the known residue that you would find of nanoparticles of aluminum oxide and other constituent materials that are used in thermate explosives. It was undeniable. And so it really suggests very strongly that there were some aspects of controlled demolition employed in the bringing down of the World Trade Center, and including Building 7, which was never hit by any of the debris from the building's collapse or from the planes that hit them. So we know that there was something going on there other than just two planes being flown into buildings.
Right, and then speaking of planes and jet fuel, I have a question because it sounds like it's, this aluminum oxide is being added to the jet fuel, and we will get into those nano-sized particles as well a little further. But is this all jet fuel, or is this only military craft, or is this all commercial airliners as well?
Well, that's a question I really don't have an answer to. I can tell you that when I really started taking notice of this kind of activity, I went out and I bought probably about the most powerful set of binoculars I could find. They're 20 by 80 fixed focal length Barska binoculars. They're practically mil-spec, and it pulls the planes in really close when I brace myself against something so I can keep my hands steady. But surprisingly, I'm seeing a lot of the aircraft flying over Northern California that seem to be laying down these chemtrails appear to be aircraft 737-700s, which is a late model version of the 737, the Boeing aircraft, in the livery of Southwest Airlines, of all things. Now, I've also seen, and I've also seen aircraft that appear to have no livery whatsoever. The planes are painted all white, top, bottom, under the wings, on top of the wings, the tail, the engines, everything, all white. No livery, no tail numbers, no markings of any kind that can be seen. And the only other paint scheme that I've seen with a fair amount of frequency is an aircraft that has a white ventral surface, that is the underside of the wings, the fuselage, and the engines, and then the upper half of this aircraft is a kind of I don't know, sort of a medium blue, almost like the blue you'd find on a Pepsi-Cola can, and so I went through a kind of a series of searches trying to figure out what airlines carried that particular paint scheme on their 747s, which was the kind of aircraft that I saw with this paint scheme, and it looked like it was, I don't know, Royal Dutch or KLM Airlines from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also seen a number of Airbus aircraft, which of course are produced in Europe, that were spraying from not only the engines, but the entire trailing edge of the main wing. So that clearly showed me that this wasn't some kind of, material being added to the fuel and coming out the back end of the engines as some kind of combustion byproduct. It was clearly something that was being sprayed from some kind of dispensing system along the trailing edge of the entire wing. And so that clearly suggested to me anyway that there was some other motive for this stuff being put into the air aside from extending the range of aircraft or greater combustion efficiency and a lower expense, if you will, mm-hmm. in the use of fuel to fly planes from one spot to another. So.
Well, and now you're and thanks for answering those questions, because these are general questions that come up over and over and over again when people are trying to put this stuff together. Now, you also had mentioned to me regarding weather modification. We'll back up a little bit because you did mention that with the weather modification programs and what we are seeing in the sky. Geoengineering, chemtrailing, what have you. Are these all sort of compartmentalized and separate type programs? In other words, owning the weather by 2025 is a document, military application, and then there, what other purpose would there be? You just mentioned one, more fuel efficiency, cost effective. And then what would be another component to these wingtip to wingtip sprayings?
Well, you mean what is the desired outcome?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
is this wrapped into weather modification? Because we are seeing, in general, a lot of extreme weather and a lot of catastrophes. Our country alone, where bringing up the fires. You and I had a long conversation about the fires that we're experiencing right here in Arizona, and some of the. I've been in touch with Evergreen Aviation because they've got the super tanker. It's the only one of its kind in the world. It can put out fires pretty quickly, and Evergreen Aviation was telling me that the United States won't hire them to put out any fires. Every fire they've ever put out has been a foreign fire. Mexico's hired them. Israel's got a super tanker. So why aren't we using the super tanker to put out fires? And what are these fires consisting of at this point? What is happening? Why are these fires burning faster, according to the forest representatives? Forest, whatever. Why are they burning harder, faster, longer? Can you help us to understand that as well?
Well, first let me say that my brother married into a family of policemen, and his oldest son Edward became a firefighter. So firefighters hold a very special place in my heart. I've known a lot of them, and they do a tremendous job, a very risky job, and this is why answering your question as honestly as I can is very important to me. Now, a minute ago we were talking about how aluminum oxide plays a key role in certain kinds of pyrotechnics and explosives. One of the reasons is that if you do a Google search of thermite or super thermite, you'll find that one of the reasons that this type of explosive is able to produce such high temperatures and be so devastating as an explosive material is because of the fine granulation, superfine granulation in the form of nanoparticles of the aluminum oxide and other components that are in the explosives, because the reaction is able to propagate through the fine particulation much faster than, say, if you had little chunks of aluminum, because, you know, it helps to dissipate the heat of the reaction through the material much faster, so you get a much faster reaction, much higher temperatures. Okay. If you're going to think about using aluminum oxide nanoparticles as a material to have nuclei forming, moisture-forming nuclei in the atmosphere to produce rain, there's some excess baggage that comes along with it. There's some collateral problems that you have, and one of which is that when you put a tremendous volume of this fine aluminum powder into the air, it does the same kind of thing that you have a problem with in volcanic reactions, where you have all of the pumice and the dust and the sulfur and all these fine particulates of materials from the earth blowing up into the air and swirling around. It produces a tremendous electrostatic charge. And so you have a much higher potential for the production of lightning, aside from the fact that aluminum oxide itself is a conductor. So it raises the potential for lightning strikes dramatically in any kind of a thunderstorm that is created using this technology. But if this kind of technology is used over the long haul, say over 5 or 10 years, where you're constantly trying to force a situation in the meteorology of a local environment so that you have more moisture, more rainfall than the standard environmental conditions would allow, you're probably going to get more rain and you're probably going to get more lightning, but you're also going to have this aluminum oxide in the rain droplets settling out as the rain falls. And so it gets into the environment, it gets into the soils, it raises the alkalinity of the soil, so it makes it much more difficult for the microorganisms that help to break down the soil so trees can ingest those nutrients through the root system. So the trees start to die. You start seeing the falling off of populations of the microorganisms and the invertebrates, little insects and things that the birds and the fish eat. But you also see the aluminum oxide sort of becoming embedded in the environment, not only in the soil but also on the trees, in the trees, absorbed through the root systems. And then when the lightning strike comes and the dead trees or the dying trees begin to be consumed in the conflagration, you're going to find, unfortunately, that all that aluminum oxide is going to help to make these fires much hotter, burning much faster across the landscape. Very, very difficult to control, very, very difficult to put out, because the aluminum oxide keeps introducing oxygen back into the burning reaction. Now, I've seen fires in Southern California, even back before, the chemtrails and these campaigns started. And one of the problems they would have, especially during drought conditions, was that even the root structures that go down beneath the ground continue to burn for hours and days later, where you can see flare-ups that happen even days later, where you have to go back in and do some kind of surgical strikes on different areas where the fire's already passed. And so these things can continue to burn for a long time, particularly if you have aluminum in the environment that is helping to exacerbate the problem.
And that's it right there. I was going to ask, is there, being that this aluminum oxide forest fire versus, as you said, normal burn conditions, are there some remedies to this? In other words, are the fire marshals, are they aware? You know what I mean? Are they aware that these fires are not normal? I know that I have read quite a bit on this, and they are aware, but they're acting like they don't know why the fires are burning hotter and faster, et cetera. So are there other components to this? For instance, perhaps with the evergreen, are they already versed and up on this, and perhaps have other additives to be able to put these fires out faster, because they do make some pretty amazing claims?
Well, of course, the big problem that you have is that even when you put extinguishing materials like bauxite and some of the other materials, this reddish material they spray from some of the firebombing aircraft, the problem is that these kinds of materials do not necessarily help to completely extinguish the fire, because remember, if you've got aluminum oxide involved in the combustion process, it continues to add oxygen to the reaction. Even when the atmospheric air is cut off, you still have oxygen being introduced into the combustion process because it's in the wood, it's in the ground, it's in the bark of the trees. And so even if you wrap the tree up in a big fireproof plastic bag and cut off its source of any oxygen from the atmosphere, the aluminum oxide is still there producing oxygen that sustains the reaction. And that's the problem. That's why it's so difficult to put out. And so I don't know that there is a solution. I'm not a chemist, and I don't know whether there's a connection between the chemtrails and a specially designed system that would be more effective at putting fires out or spraying retardant on the fires, all coming from one company. It kind of reminds me of certain kinds of like the involvement with Monsanto producing and patenting plants that are resistant to aluminum oxide. I mean, why on the earth would they produce plant crops, food crops that are resistant to aluminum oxide unless they somehow know that this is an element that's being introduced into the environment in dramatically higher levels than we've ever seen before, and possibly and most likely by some artificial means. So all of the things that I've seen here suggest that there are a lot of people who know about this, a lot of people who are involved in it. Whether there's a profit motive on one end or the other, I'm not really sure. But you really have to kind of ask yourself, why the heck are they doing this? If it has so many terrible side effects. I mean, not only in the burning of the forests. What is it, over 1,000 square miles in Arizona and New Mexico right now that have been burned
Yes.
in the last 3 weeks to a month?
Yes.
So I mean, this is something that is very upsetting. I mean, when you imagine, I've heard descriptions of people, being escorted out of these burn areas, seeing herds of deer running through the forest on fire. I mean, it's like that the movie Knowing, where it shows a solar mass projectile hitting the earth, and there's a sense of helplessness that comes with this that's extremely bothersome to me, and. But so you have to ask yourself. Go ahead.
Mark, sorry. We're at the top of the hour, and I want to let the audience know that because we haven't even gotten to a couple of other debates here that you and I wanted to talk about. We're going to extend another half hour if that's okay with you.
Sure, I can go another half hour or another hour if you want. Doesn't bother me.
Well, Mark, that is amazing. Thank you. And for the listeners that are listening, I know that some of you are calling in, and there's quite a few people in the chat room that have questions. I do have a caller. I have a feeling I might know who this is. I might not. But let's let the caller from Canada come on the line, please. And welcome to The Truth Denied. Who's calling?
Hey, Roxy. How's it going?
Hi. Who's calling?
This is Andrew Schneider.
Andrew,
I talked to you a couple weeks back there.
Yes, Andrew.
We were discussing chemtrails there.
Yes, we were. Thanks for calling, Andrew. You have a question for Mark?
Well, it's just one of the topics that you were discussing earlier about markings on the planes, and we're wondering where we can start or begin to find out who and where and how to launch an investigation. What we need to do is pin down one instance. If we can just get a hold of one plane that we could actually locate these systems, that would be a major step.
Well, my suggestion would be go up online and search for it's a downloadable program. It's called Plane Finder. That's Plane Finder. It's a program that you can plug into your iPhone, I believe, or put on or download into your computer at home. And if you are outside and you see a plane flying overhead that has chemtrails coming out behind it, these trails that persist for hundreds of miles back over the horizon and stay there for hours. But if you can catch the plane as it's going overhead, point your iPhone at it and plug in this application, it'll not only tell you the flight number, it'll tell you the kind of aircraft it is, it'll tell you the point of origin, it'll even tell you who the carrier is. And so this is one of the tools that we are starting to use. I've been working with G. Edward Griffin and Michael Murphy, who produced the film What in the World Are They Spraying, and some other folks, Clifford Carnicom. We're all trying to put together a network of observers, people who can kind of track and keep an idea, or help us, find, who's operating the aircraft that we're seeing these trails coming from. Now, I can't imagine that someone in the hierarchy of one of the major airlines like Southwest or KLM, any of these companies, if they're using these, range extenders in the fuel, if there is any kind of competition-sensitive secret within the industry as to whether or not they're using these kind of additives in the fuel. And so I think that it might be a good idea to just be very direct and ask someone in the corporate headquarters of these particular companies if in fact they are using these range extender aluminum oxide nanoparticles and things like that. But I admire your willingness to kind of pursue this and try and figure out who's responsible. I know the Roxy has done some groundbreaking work in this area in terms of the planes that are being operated out of I think it's Pinal County Airport, northwest of Tucson. So something that you can even see on Google Earth. You can see the big storage tanks for the materials that the planes are loading and dispensing in the air. And it's been rather controversial.
Right. We've under my investigations, I've kind of gone down the path looking into fuel additives such as what they call anti-static dispersants that they add to the fuel, and according to one source, the amounts that they supposedly put into the fuel systems doesn't amount to what would create what we're seeing right now. There's products such as Apollo DGT-3. That one is used in commercial airlines. There's also Octel Steron. I think they've formerly been bought out by somebody else. I'm not sure what the company is now that owns them, but they had a product called Status 450, which was also an anti-static component, both of which contain aluminum nanopowders. And their excuse for using these is to prevent fires in the fuel systems. That was one of the things. Now, back in January, we had I had found this fellow from New York Skywatch, who had actually done a video. I forget what month it was, earlier from the summer previous. And he had a video of 3 planes flying out of coming off the horizon, showing chemtrails. One of them, he managed to get a close-up of the fuselage, and it showed definitely that it was a Cargolux plane. Now, he has the time and the date of that flight, and he also has the video evidence of that flight. And another thing that was of interest that I forwarded to him was the information about the fact that Cargolux is one of about 4 or 5 companies listed in the Aurora Geoengineering Cost Analysis Report, which was prepared for David Keith at the University of California, one of the head people that's promoting geoengineering.